All right, welcome back to the Market Chronicles. We are on episode number 11, and you know what that means.
Another deep dive
Another deep dive.
into the markets.
Yeah, we're going to be taking a look at the insightful commentary from Lyn Alden today.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting stuff to go over today. Really, her perspective on the current market conditions, particularly what's going on with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And then also kind of like the bigger picture of what's going on with the economy.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
we're going to break this down for you in a way that's going to make sense, give you that professional level understanding without overwhelming you with a bunch of
Charts and data.
and all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep it lighthearted as always. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button
Yes.
so you don't miss any future episodes. I mean, future deep dives.
That's right. Deep dive.
Deep dives. So yeah, Lyn Alden, she had some really interesting things to say about, market sentiment, particularly when it comes to Bitcoin.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting is she's saying that we haven't really seen true market extremes yet in this cycle.
Yeah, and that's something that, people always talk about. It's like, when are we going to see the top, right? Like, is it the top? Is that the top?
Yeah. And you look at
She's angry.
like the March 2024 breakout to 73,000. It was, a little bit euphoric, but it wasn't that kind of like historical multi-year top.
Right. It wasn't one of those things where you're like, oh, man, that was definitely a blow off top.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you look at even more recently, like the move up to 100,000, 108,000.
Yeah.
And again, there were some metrics that looked a little overdone, but it wasn't like this huge multi-year dislocation.
Yeah. And her analysis is basically like leading towards, a higher probability of breaking upwards rather than downwards at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she's saying, until we see significantly higher prices, a multi-year bear market is unlikely.
Right. So that's something to think about.
It is.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about this whole executive order from the U.S. government, right? The one about seized and forfeited cryptocurrencies.
Right. With a particular emphasis on
especially Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that I think a lot of people were kind of like, scratching their heads about.
Well, so
what does this really mean?
How does Lyn Alden interpret this?
Right.
Well, it seems like she's saying that this is essentially kind of ring fencing the Bitcoin that the government has. They're not going to sell it.
Right. Because they're basically just holding it.
Yeah, and that's a really big deal because, people were worried that they were going to dump it on the market.
Right, and crash the price and all that.
Exactly.
And the other really interesting thing that she pointed out is that, it does kind of open the door, maybe not a huge door, but it opens the door for the government to actually find ways to accumulate more Bitcoin.
Yeah, it does. It says that the Treasury can explore budget-neutral ways to potentially acquire more Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not like they're going to go out and buy a ton of it.
Right.
But, there are these little ways that they could potentially
chip away at it.
Yeah.
Right. And just slowly increase their holdings.
And that's interesting.
It is interesting. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was how it really separates Bitcoin from the rest of the crypto world, right? It's like,
it's like Bitcoin's in its own category now.
Its own thing. Yeah. It's like, the order specifically says, hey, don't sell this Bitcoin,
Right.
But then it says, oh, the Treasury Secretary, you can do whatever you want with all the other cryptos.
You can sell those if you want.
Like Dogecoin, whatever.
Exactly.
And Lyn Alden sees this as actually a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like the government's picking favorites amongst all these different.
When you have all these other cryptocurrencies that kind of have these securities aspects to them or, have actual issuers.
Right.
It makes sense to separate Bitcoin because it's so different.
Yeah. And so her main takeaway there is basically we should expect that the government's not going to be selling their Bitcoin anymore.
Yeah. Which is
huge.
A big deal.
Yeah. Because that was always this like overhang, right? This fear of like, oh man, what if they just dump all this Bitcoin on the market?
Right. Yeah.
But she also cautions against, reading too much into it.
Right.
As far as like, is the government going to come in and buy $1 bazillion worth of Bitcoin and then the price is going to go to the moon?
Yeah. Don't expect like a huge U.S. government-driven bull run.
Right.
Her base case is still kind of like flat to mildly up.
Right.
Yeah.
It's more about removing that selling pressure than creating like massive buying pressure.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So let's talk about what Lyn Alden's actually keeping an eye on these days. Right? Like what are the indicators that she's watching?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it seems like she's kind of shifted away from like strict price targets.
Yeah.
And now she's really looking more at like market sentiment and these underlying conditions.
Yeah, she's really trying to get a feel for like when are we going to see that, euphoria, those levels of euphoria that historically have led to big corrections.
Yeah.
And so one of the things she's watching really closely is Bitcoin's correlation with liquidity.
Yeah, now when we say liquidity, I think a lot of people might just think inflation.
Right.
But she's talking about something a little bit
Broader
than that.
Yeah, it's really tied to the expansion of the monetary base.
Right.
And she sees that as kind of like a key driver for how Bitcoin performs.
So basically like
Bitcoin does better when there's more liquidity sloshing around in the system.
more money printing.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
she's connecting that to like a debasement narrative.
Right.
You know?
So it's not just like, oh, prices are going up because of CPI. It's like,
Yeah.
no, the actual value of the dollar is being diluted.
Exactly.
And then the on-chain metric that she's really watching here is the market value compared to the on-chain average cost basis.
Yes.
And this is something that, a lot of people might not be familiar with. So can you kind of break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so basically the on-chain average cost basis is like the average price that all the Bitcoin that's out there, all the circulating Bitcoin, was last moved on the blockchain.
Right. So like the last time it was traded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what she's looking at is how does the current market price compare to that average cost basis?
Right.
And historically, when you see like a huge divergence, like when the market value goes like 5 to 10x higher
Wow.
than the average cost basis, and it's driven by like a really small number of coins trading, that can be a sign of like unsustainable speculation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So like basically people are getting really, really excited,
They're getting euphoric.
but it's not based on like a
Fundamental.
lot of actual buying and selling.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like a small group of people driving the price up.
And then everyone else is kind of like, oh, wow, look at that.
Yeah. And then as soon as that energy fades,
Right. Then it all comes crashing down.
the market's vulnerable to a correction.
Yeah. And she made this really great analogy with real estate.
Yeah. I loved that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you kind of explain that for the folks at home?
So imagine you have a neighborhood where there haven't been many houses sold recently.
Okay.
And then one house sells for like way more than any other house is sold for.
Right. Like a crazy price.
A crazy price.
Yeah.
Does that mean that suddenly every other house on the street is worth that much?
Right. Does that change the value of the whole neighborhood?
No, not necessarily. You
Okay.
need to see like a bunch of houses selling at that new level to really say, okay, this is the new average.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
like one data point doesn't make a trend.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so she's applying that same logic
Yeah.
to Bitcoin. Right.
Yeah. She's saying that those initial price spikes, they might just involve like a small fraction of the total supply.
Right.
The average cost basis only really starts to adjust upwards when you have more and more coins changing hands at those higher prices.
Right. So you need more widespread participation.
Yeah, you need that confirmation
Yeah.
that this new price level is valid.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And her analysis is basically saying that we're not there yet.
right.
Like we haven't seen that crazy divergence between the market value and the average cost basis.
No, not yet.
That would signal like, uh-oh, big correction coming.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not that euphoric widespread participation
Not yet.
where a small number of coins are driving the price way up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Last but not least, let's talk about Lyn Alden's perspective on, good old U.S. dollar, the world's reserve currency,
Yes, the big one.
the big kahuna.
Yeah.
And this is a big topic.
It is a big topic
It's a complex topic.
with a lot of consequences.
Yeah, she talks about this monetary premium that the dollar gets
Right.
just by virtue of being the world's reserve currency, right?
Yeah, it's
So
not just about trade balances and interest rate differentials.
Yeah.
It's like this extra oomph that the dollar has
yeah,
because it's the world's money.
because everyone uses it.
Yeah,
Right?
everyone needs dollars.
Yeah, and so even like
Like a company in France might finance a transaction with a company in Brazil using U.S. dollars.
right, even though it has nothing to do with the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just the currency that everyone uses.
It's the easiest,
Yeah.
most liquid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this global demand for dollars, it can kind of leads to the dollar being overvalued.
Yeah, structurally overvalued.
Yeah, and this is something that has a lot of implications for the U.S. economy, right? Like
It does.
it affects trade, it affects
Yeah, it makes our imports cheaper and our exports more expensive.
right
And that can hurt our manufacturing base because...
because people would rather buy the cheaper stuff from overseas.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then all those dollars that we send overseas to buy that stuff, they often end up coming back as investments in U.S. assets,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
Means we're basically trading ownership in our companies and our property for
Yeah.
a bunch of depreciating goods.
It's like we're selling off the farm,
Yeah, kind of.
right?
Yeah.
And she connects this to, bigger societal issues like deindustrialization and populism.
Right, because these economic shifts, they can lead to job losses
Yeah.
and a concentration of wealth,
Yeah.
and that can fuel a lot of discontent.
Yeah, people get upset.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems like the U.S. government is kind of in a tough spot here
They are?
because they're trying to balance, this desire to kind of like, realign trade,
Right.
but also maintain the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, you can't really have both.
Right.
If you try to weaken the dollar to make your exports more competitive,
Right.
that could undermine its role as a global reserve currency.
Right. And then everyone's like, well, why are we using the dollar anymore?
Exactly.
If it's not
Mm-hmm.
strong.
Yeah.
And so there's all these like policy conflicts that she points out. Like,
Yeah.
on the one hand, they might want to, discourage foreign investment in treasuries.
Right.
But then on the other hand, they might want to promote stablecoins,
Right.
which would increase demand for dollars.
Yeah. It's a tricky situation.
It's like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah. And her long-term outlook on this is that it's going to be a very, very slow process.
Right.
Like decades
Trade
long.
beans. Yeah.
Unwinding these
Yeah.
imbalances.
Yeah. It's not going to happen overnight.
No.
Yeah.
These things take time.
All right. So let's recap here real quick.
Just to make sure everyone's following along at home. Lyn Alden's key insights. The Bitcoin market doesn't look like it's topping out yet.
Right.
The executive order on Bitcoin mainly signals the end of the government sales.
Yeah.
We need to see more extreme levels in those on-chain metrics before we should really start worrying about a big correction
Right.
and the dollar's status as the reserve currency.
That's going to be a long and complicated story.
Yeah, it's going to be with us for a while.
Yeah.
And I think the key takeaway here for me is just how interconnected all this stuff is.
It is.
Right? Like we've got monetary policy.
Yeah.
We've got technology like Bitcoin.
Right.
We've got these global economic shifts.
And it's all intertwined.
It's all happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's all affecting each other.
Absolutely.
So it's really a fascinating time to be watching the markets.
It is.
And I think it's more important than ever to really understand what's going on.
You need to have that deep understanding.
So you can make informed decisions.
Yeah, and not just react to the headlines.
Exactly. Got to see the big picture.
All right, so that's it for this week's deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time
Yeah, next time.
on the Market Chronicles.
Take care.